My name is Ibrahim Traore. There was a time when I believed I was standing on the side of justice. I did not see myself as a cruel man. I did not wake up each morning with a heart full of hatred. I did not hunt people out of a desire for violence. I simply followed orders. I trusted the system that trained me, shaped me, and gave me a uniform as a symbol of honor. I convinced myself that obedience was duty, that duty was honor, and that honor was enough to silence all doubt. I did not kill out of anger. I killed because I was ordered to. There are things a person can bury deep within their memory for many years. Fragments of the past pushed into silence until even we begin to believe they are gone. But there are also truths that refuse to sleep. They return in the quiet of night when there is no one left to lie to. And this is one of those truths. There was a time when I took part in the killing of more than 10 Christian believers. Not on a battlefield, not in the crossfire of war, but in villages, inside small churches, in places where people knelt down to pray. I know how that sounds. You may judge me. You may turn your back. You may decide right now that nothing I say has any value. I do not blame you, because even I still struggle on many nights to understand how I became that person. But what haunts me is not only what I did, it is why I did it. Because the truth behind those orders is more terrifying than the actions themselves. If I remain silent, those people, those voices will disappear forever. And I cannot allow that to happen. Not now, not ever again. So I choose to speak, not to ask for forgiveness, not to justify myself, but to tell the truth. The story begins in 2019. At that time, I was not yet a president. I was just a young officer, stationed in the northern part of Burkina Faso, near the Sahel, a place where the line between right and wrong had already begun to blur. In that place, survival replaced morality. Decisions were no longer based on justice, but on whether you could live one more day. Religion, something that should have brought peace, had become distorted. It had become a weapon. Churches were burned, attacked in acts of revenge. Villages were divided, not by land, but by belief. People were forced to choose sides, even when they never wanted to. And we, the soldiers, were taught what to believe. That the enemy was anyone who did not stand with us. That those of different faiths could become a threat. That even a moment of hesitation could cost a life. And I believed all of it. I believed I was protecting my country. I believed that everything I did was necessary. And that belief was where everything began. That belief was what turned me into someone I never thought I could become. At the time, I did not realize it, but I had already stepped onto a path that would lead to the destruction of my soul. And now, I will tell you the whole story. The year was 2019. I remember it not as a date, but as a weight. At that time, I was not a president. I was a young officer stationed near the northern edge of Burkina Faso, close to a place called Gorom Gorom. It sat near the borders of Mali and Niger, where the land stretched wide and unforgiving, and where authority often felt distant. There were no clear lines there, no clear enemies, no clear truth, only movement, fear, and survival. Every morning began with uncertainty. We did not know if the road ahead would be quiet or if it would explode beneath our feet. We did not know if the faces we passed would greet us or betray us. We did not know if the next village we entered would still be standing. In that region, more than 1,000 attacks had taken place in just 1 year. Each one left behind silence, smoke, and grief. Civilians were no longer observers of conflict. They had become its center. Families disappeared, homes burned, and entire communities were pushed into exile, forced to leave behind everything they had built. I remember the camps. People gathered under makeshift shelters, their lives reduced to what they could carry. Children who no longer played, mothers who no longer cried, because even grief had become too heavy. We were sent there as soldiers. But what did that mean? Were we protectors? Or were we simply another force moving through their lives, bringing fear in a different uniform? At the time, I did not ask these questions, because we were trained not to ask. We were trained to act. We were told that hesitation could cost lives, that doubt could spread like weakness, that clarity, even if it was harsh, was better than uncertainty. And so we accepted the version of truth that was given to us. We were told that the enemy was everywhere, not just those carrying weapons, but those who supported them, those who spoke differently, those who believed differently. Religion, which should have been a source of peace, had already been transformed into something sharp. Churches had been attacked. Mosques had been burned in retaliation. People no longer prayed freely. They prayed with fear, knowing that even faith could make them a target. And in that environment, belief itself became suspicious. We were taught to see patterns: a gathering at night, a sermon that sounded unfamiliar, a symbol worn openly. These things, we were told, could signal danger. And slowly, without realizing it, we began to look at people not as individuals but as possibilities. Possible threats, possible enemies, possible targets. I believed it. I believed that if I questioned it, I would be putting others at risk. I believed that discipline meant trust, and that trust meant obedience. I told myself that I was part of something larger, that I was defending my country, that I was standing between chaos and order. And in those early days, that belief gave me strength. It gave me purpose. It allowed me to silence the small voice inside me that sometimes asked, what if we were wrong? Because in a place like that, you cannot survive if you listen to that voice too often. You push it down. You replace it with certainty, even if that certainty is built on fear. I remember the briefings. We would sit together, listening to reports of attacks, movements, and suspected networks. Names would be mentioned. Locations would be marked. Patterns would be drawn. And always there was a sense that we were chasing something invisible, an enemy that could blend into the population, an enemy that could pray, speak, and live like everyone else. And that idea changed everything. Because once you begin to believe that your enemy can look like anyone, you begin to see enemies everywhere. I did not notice when my perspective began to shift. It did not happen all at once. It happened slowly, quietly, one decision at a time. At first, we were cautious. We verified. We questioned. But over time, the pressure increased. The attacks did not stop. The fear did not fade. And patience began to feel like weakness. I remember one of my superiors saying something that stayed with me. He said, "In war, waiting for certainty is how you lose." At the time, it made sense. Now, I hear it differently, because what he was really saying was this: act before you know the truth. And once you accept that, everything becomes easier. Too easy. That was the environment I lived in. A place where fear shaped judgment, where belief replaced evidence, where action mattered more than understanding, and where, without realizing it, I was already being prepared for something darker. Something that would not feel like war, but would be called necessary. I did not yet know that the most dangerous part of that time was not the violence around us. It was the way we began to justify it, the way we began to normalize it, the way we stopped seeing the people in front of us as people. That was the beginning, not of the killings, but of the mindset that made them possible. And once that mindset takes hold, the rest follows. Everything changed when he appeared. Until that moment, the war had felt chaotic, but still understandable. There were attacks, responses, and a constant effort to maintain control. It was brutal, but it still followed a kind of logic. Then came General Karim al-Hassan. He was not a man who spoke loudly. He did not need to. His presence alone carried weight. When he entered a room, conversations stopped. When he gave instructions, no one asked questions. He was known for results. He was also known for his beliefs. People said he saw the conflict not just as a military struggle, but as something deeper, something ideological, something that needed to be purified. At the time, I did not fully understand what that meant. I only knew that when he took control of operations in our region, things began to change. Orders became sharper, more direct, less concerned with explanation. There were fewer discussions and more commands. And then, one day, I was called in, not to a briefing room, not in front of a group, but alone. I remember walking into that space. It was quiet, no maps on the wall, no noise from radios, just a table, 2 chairs, and him. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking, not with anger, not with urgency, but with certainty. He said something I have never forgotten. There is no place for doubt, only orders. At the time, I nodded, because that is what a soldier does. He then explained the mission, not in detail, not with strategy, but with intent. We were to remove certain individuals, not enemy fighters, not armed groups, but people, specific people. He described them as obstacles, as influences that needed to be eliminated, as threats not because of what they had done, but because of what they represented. He spoke of priests, of religious figures, of those who did not align. He said they were spreading ideas that weakened the nation, that they were connected to foreign influence, that they could not be allowed to continue. The words he used were careful. He did not say kill. He said cleanse. He did not say execute. He said stabilize. But the meaning was clear. We were to eliminate them quietly, without noise, without attention. There would be no trials, no investigations, no evidence presented, only names, a list, and instructions. Some would be taken at night. Some would be dealt with in places where no one would question their absence. And some would disappear in ways that left no trace at all. Poison in a clinic, an injection that would not be questioned, a death that could be explained as illness. It was all planned, structured, systematic, and what made it more dangerous was how calmly it was delivered. As if this was not something extraordinary, as if this was simply another step in maintaining order. I remember sitting there listening, and for the first time, I felt something shift inside me. Not fear, not yet, but hesitation. A question began to form, not loud, not strong, but present. Is this still war, or is this something else? I did not ask it out loud, because I already knew the answer would not matter. Orders had been given, and in that system, orders were final. He looked at me again before I left, and he said, "History will not remember hesitation. It will remember those who acted." At the time, I accepted that. I told myself that he understood things I did not, that he saw a bigger picture, that this was necessary, that this was for the country, that this was for stability. I told myself many things, because it was easier than confronting the truth that was already beginning to take shape, that this was no longer about defense, no longer about protection. This was about control, about removing anything that did not fit a certain vision. And I had just been chosen to carry it out. I walked out of that room with a list, names I did not know, faces I had not yet seen, lives I had not yet taken. And yet, in that moment, something inside me already understood that once I began, there would be no going back. The first time, I hesitated. Until that moment, everything had still existed in theory, names on paper, instructions delivered in a quiet room, a mission that felt distant, almost unreal. But theory becomes reality the moment you stand in front of a human being. The first name on my list was a man called Father Emmanuel. He was 62 years old. He served in a small church in the Udalan province. The building was simple. No guards, no weapons, just a place where people gathered to pray. We arrived at night. There were no lights except the faint glow from inside. The air was still. No resistance, no sign of danger. This was not a battlefield. It was a place of peace. We entered quietly. He was there, alone. He did not run. He did not shout. He did not reach for anything. He simply looked at me, and in that moment, everything slowed. I had been trained to act quickly, to assess threats, to move without hesitation, but there was no threat in front of me. Only a man, an old man. He looked at me, not with fear, but with calm. That is what disturbed me the most. Not anger, not panic, calm. As if he already understood why I was there. As if he had accepted something I had not yet accepted myself. He spoke. His voice was steady. He said, "My son, I will pray for you." I remember those words clearly, not because they were loud, but because they were quiet, and because they reached something inside me that I had been trying not to feel. For a brief moment, I wanted to stop. I wanted to question the order. I wanted to step back and say this was wrong. But another voice spoke louder. The voice of training. The voice of command. The voice that reminded me who I was supposed to be. A soldier. A man who follows orders. A man who does not hesitate. And so, I pulled the trigger. The sound was louder than I expected. Or maybe it only felt that way. Because in that moment, everything else became silent. He fell. And just like that, it was done. There was no struggle. No resistance. No chaos. Just a life ending. I stood there for a moment, not moving, not thinking, just standing, waiting for something. I do not know what. Maybe I expected to feel something strong. Shock, guilt, fear. But what I felt was something else. Something colder, a kind of emptiness. As if a part of me had stepped aside to let the act happen. And once it was done, that part did not return. We left quickly. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The mission had been completed. The first name crossed off the list. After that, it became easier. Not immediately, but faster than I want to admit. The second time, I did not hesitate as long. The third time, I did not hesitate at all. Within 3 months, the numbers began to grow. 4 priests were executed. 3 others died in what were reported as medical incidents. 5 believers were taken. They never returned. At first, I tried to remember them. Their faces, their voices, their names. But over time, those details began to fade, and something else replaced them. Numbers, counts, results. It became a system, a process, a routine. We would receive information. We would confirm identity. We would act. And then we would move on. No ceremonies, no records, no acknowledgement, just silence. And in that silence, something inside me continued to change. I began to notice it, not in what I did, but in what I no longer felt. The hesitation that had once slowed me down disappeared. The questions that had once formed in my mind stopped appearing. Even the memory of that first night became less vivid, as if my mind was protecting me, or perhaps erasing something it could not carry. I do not know which is worse, forgetting or remembering without feeling, because both mean that something important has been lost. I did not wake up one day and decide to become this person. It happened gradually, one action at a time, one decision at a time, until the line between right and wrong no longer mattered. Only the mission, only the order, only the outcome. That is how it begins. Not with hatred, not with cruelty, but with obedience. And once obedience replaces conscience, a man can do things he never thought possible and still believe he is doing the right thing. After the 5th name, something changed in me. It was not sudden. There was no moment where I stopped and said, I am becoming someone else. It happened quietly, so quietly that I did not fully notice it at first. But I began to see people differently, not as individuals, not as lives with stories, families, or memories, but as categories, as signs, as risks. A Bible in someone's hand was no longer a symbol of faith. It became a signal. A cross around the neck was no longer personal. It became evidence. A prayer was no longer a moment of peace. It became suspicion. That is how far I had drifted. I did not ask who they were. I asked what they represented. And once you begin to see people that way, it becomes easy to justify anything. I stopped noticing age. Old men, young women, children. They all became the same in my eyes. What mattered was not who they were. What mattered was whether they fit the pattern we had been taught to fear. And if they did, that was enough. My unit began to speak differently too. We no longer used names. We used numbers. We counted. We compared. We even laughed sometimes. That is something I struggled to admit. Not because it was funny, but because it had become normal. What once would have shocked us no longer did. We called it success. We called it progress. We told ourselves that each action brought stability, that each removal made the region safer. But deep inside, there was a silence growing. Not peace, not satisfaction, but a silence where something used to be. I spoke less, not because I had nothing to say, but because I did not want to hear my own thoughts. Because if I allowed myself to think clearly, I might begin to question everything. And questioning had become dangerous, not just within the system, but within myself. So I stayed quiet. I followed orders. I completed missions. And I allowed the process to continue. There were moments, though, small moments, where something would break through. A glance, a word, a hesitation that lasted just a second longer than it should have. And in those moments, I would feel it. A reminder that the people in front of me were still human. But those moments did not last, because I had learned how to push them away. I told myself that emotion was weakness, that hesitation was risk, that compassion could get someone killed. So I hardened myself, not out of cruelty, but out of survival. That is the truth that many do not understand. Evil does not always come from hatred. Sometimes it comes from adaptation, from learning to function in an environment where feeling too much becomes a liability. And so you reduce what you feel. You narrow your perspective. You simplify the world into categories that are easier to manage. Friend, enemy, threat, target. And once the world is divided that way, everything becomes easier, too easy. I remember looking at my reflection one day, not for long, just a moment, and I noticed something strange. I did not recognize the man looking back at me, not because he looked different, but because he felt different. There was no anger in his eyes, no visible struggle, just distance, as if he had stepped away from himself, as if he was watching his own actions without truly being present. At the time, I did not stop. I did not change, because I believed that this was necessary, that this was what it meant to be strong, to be disciplined, to be a soldier. I told myself that the world we lived in did not allow softness, that survival required hardness, and that anything else was a luxury we could not afford. But now, looking back, I see it clearly. That was not strength. That was loss, the loss of something essential, something that, once gone, is not easily returned. I did not become less human in one moment. I became less human, step by step, with each order followed without question, with each life reduced to a number, with each feeling pushed aside, until one day, there was almost nothing left to push. And that is when the next moment came. The moment that changed everything. Everything changed. On a night that did not seem different at first, we had received another name, another location, another mission. By then, it had become routine. We moved without emotion, without discussion. The process was familiar. We did not ask why anymore. We only confirmed when and where. The target was a small family. The father was identified as a priest. No weapons. No known resistance. Just another entry on the list. We arrived after dark. The house was simple. One room, a dim light inside. No guards, no movement that suggested danger. We approached as we always did. Quietly, carefully, prepared for anything. But there was nothing. When we entered, they were there. The father and a child, a little girl, no more than 10 years old. She stood close to him, not hiding, not crying, just watching. The father looked at us first. His face was tired but calm. I had seen that look before. Not fear, not anger, something else. Something I did not understand at the time. He spoke before we did. He said, "We are not your enemies." I had heard similar words before, but that night, they did not pass through me the same way. Something in his voice stayed, and then the girl looked at me. I remember her eyes, clear, steady. She did not scream. She did not run. She asked a question, a simple question. Are you going to kill us? There are moments in life where time slows, where everything becomes still. That was one of them. I had faced armed men. I had faced danger. But I had never faced a question like that. Not from a child. Not from someone who was not resisting. Not from someone who was simply waiting. I did not answer her. I could not. Because for the first time, I did not know what to say. The training did not prepare me for that. The orders did not include words. They only included action. And yet, in that moment, action felt impossible. I felt something break inside me. Not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly. All the justifications I had built began to weaken. All the certainty I had relied on began to fade. I looked at the father, then at the child, and for the first time in a long time, I did not see targets. I saw people, real people, with lives, with trust, with no understanding of why I was there. And that made everything harder. Because once you see that, you cannot unsee it. My hands felt heavy. My thoughts became loud. Questions I had buried began to rise. What if they are innocent? What if this is wrong? What if everything I have been doing is not what I believed? These questions did not come gently. They came all at once. And they did not leave. The room felt smaller. The silence became louder. And I realized something I had not allowed myself to realize before. This was not war. This was something else. Something that did not follow rules. Something that did not protect. Something that destroyed quietly. I stood there between two choices, to follow the order or to stop. But stopping was not simple. Stopping meant risk. It meant consequences. It meant turning against everything I had been taught to obey. And in that moment, I hesitated, longer than I ever had before. I do not remember how long it lasted. Seconds, maybe more. But it felt like time had paused, waiting for me to decide. The child was still looking at me, waiting, not with fear, but with a kind of trust I did not deserve. And that was the hardest part, because I knew that whatever I did next would define who I was, not as a soldier, but as a human being. That night did not end the way the others had, but it ended something inside me, the part that had accepted everything without question, the part that had turned away from doubt, the part that had allowed me to continue. That part was gone, and in its place, something else began to grow, something uncomfortable, something unavoidable, the beginning of truth. That night, I did not sleep. I lay still, staring into the darkness, but there was no rest. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them again. The father, the child, her question, "Are you going to kill us?" It did not leave me. It repeated, over and over, not loudly, but clearly, as if it had found a place inside me that I could no longer silence. Until that moment, I had always believed something, that even if the war was messy, even if decisions were hard, there was still a line, a purpose, a justification. That belief had carried me. It had allowed me to act without breaking. It had given meaning to what I was doing. But that night, it began to fall apart. I started asking questions I had avoided for too long. Not about the mission, not about the enemy, but about myself. If they were innocent, then what was I? If they were not a threat, then what had I been doing all this time? These questions did not come with answers, only silence. And that silence was heavier than anything I had experienced before, because for the first time, I could not replace it with certainty. I could not tell myself that this was necessary. I could not convince myself that this was protection. The words no longer worked. They sounded empty, false. I began to see the pattern more clearly. The names on the list, the lack of evidence, the absence of trials, the quiet methods, the way everything was hidden. This was not a battle. It was a process, a removal, a cleansing as they called it. But I could no longer accept that word, because cleansing suggests something being purified. What I had seen was destruction, and I had been part of it. That realization did not come all at once. It came in waves, each one stronger than the last, each one harder to ignore. I remembered the faces I had tried to forget, the voices I had stopped hearing, the moments I had pushed aside. They returned, not as distant memories, but as something present, something alive. And with them came a feeling I had managed to avoid for so long. Regret, not the kind that passes quickly, but the kind that stays, the kind that changes how you see yourself. I looked at my hands, the same hands that had carried out orders, the same hands that had ended lives. And I did not see strength. I saw something else, something I did not want to name, because naming it would make it real. I stood in front of a mirror that night, just for a moment, and I asked myself a question I had never asked before. Who are you now? There was no answer, because the person I thought I was no longer existed, and the person I had become, I did not recognize. That is when fear began, not fear of the enemy, not fear of the war, but fear of myself, fear of what I had done, fear of what I was capable of continuing to do if nothing changed. I realized something that I had not allowed myself to understand before. Obedience does not remove responsibility. Following orders does not erase the truth of your actions. It only hides it. for a time. And when that truth returns, it does not ask permission. It confronts you completely. I began to understand that what we were doing was not justice. It was violence, given permission. And permission does not make it right. That realization broke something inside me. Not physically, but deeply. The foundation I had stood on was gone. And without it, I had to face everything I had done. Without protection. There are moments in life where you cannot go back. Where you cannot return to what you believed before. That was one of those moments. I could no longer pretend. I could no longer ignore. I could no longer continue without knowing exactly what I was doing. And once you reach that point, there is no easy path forward, only a choice to continue and silence what remains of your conscience, or to stop and face the consequences. I knew what each path would require. I knew what each path would cost. And for the first time, I was not thinking like a soldier. I was thinking like a man who had to decide who he truly was. After that night, nothing was the same. The missions continued. The orders still came. The structure around me did not change. But inside me, everything had shifted. I could no longer move the way I had before. I could no longer act without feeling. Every action now carried weight. Every memory returned with clarity. I began to see their faces again. Not as distant shadows, but as real people. The priest who spoke calmly before I pulled the trigger. The ones who disappeared without a trace. The voices I had ignored. The silence that followed. It all came back. And it did not come gently. It came in the quiet moments. At night. When there was no distraction. No noise. No orders to follow. Only thought. Only memory. I stopped sleeping. Not because I did not want to. But because sleep brought them closer. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them. Not accusing. Not angry. Just present. And that presence was enough. I began to fear the darkness. Because that was when everything returned. The sound of gunfire. The stillness after. The words that had been spoken before the end. The things I had chosen not to hear now became impossible to ignore. I tried to distract myself, to focus on routine, on tasks, on anything that would keep my mind occupied, but it did not last, because the mind cannot be controlled forever. Eventually, it returns to what it is trying to avoid, and when it does, it brings everything with it. I started to withdraw from others, not because they noticed, but because I could no longer stand the way we spoke, the way we joked, the way we counted. It no longer felt normal. It felt wrong, and I could not pretend otherwise. But I also could not speak, because speaking meant risk, not just for my position, but for my life. So I remained silent, trapped between what I knew and what I could not say. I looked at myself differently, not as a soldier, not as someone following orders, but as something else. A man who had taken lives without question. A man who had accepted actions without proof. A man who had become part of something he did not fully understand. There was one moment I remember clearly. I was alone, no one around, no sound, and I spoke out loud. Not to anyone, just to the silence. I said, I am not a soldier anymore. I am a killer. The words felt heavy, but also true. And once I said them, I could not take them back, because I knew they were not just words. They were a recognition, a truth I had avoided for too long. There were nights when the weight became too much, when I felt like there was no way to undo what I had done, no way to change it, no way to escape it. And in those moments, a thought began to appear, quiet at first, then stronger. Maybe the only way to make it right is to end it. I did not act on it, but the fact that it came frightened me, because it meant that I had reached a point where I no longer saw a future. Only consequences, only memory, only regret. That is what regret does. It does not just remind you of the past. It reshapes how you see yourself, how you see everything. It removes the distance you once had and forces you to stand in front of what you have done without protection. I could no longer hide behind orders. I could no longer say I did not know, because now I did know, and that knowledge could not be undone. There is a moment in every person's life where they must decide whether to continue lying to themselves or to face the truth. I had reached that moment, and I understood something clearly. If I continued, I would lose whatever remained of myself. Completely. There would be nothing left to recover, nothing left to return to, only a shell following commands. And I could not accept that. Not anymore. But stopping was not simple. Stopping meant becoming a target. Stopping meant standing alone. Stopping meant choosing truth over safety. And I knew that choice would change everything. I refused the next order. It did not happen with anger. It did not happen with a speech. It happened quietly, the way most important decisions happen. I was given another name, another location, another life to end. And for the first time, I did not prepare. I did not move. I did not act. I simply said no. The word felt small, but its weight was enormous. Because in that system, refusal was not just disobedience. It was betrayal. I could feel it immediately. The shift. The silence that followed, the way people looked at me differently, not openly, not directly, but enough to understand. I was no longer fully trusted, and in that environment, that was dangerous. Questions began, not loud questions, not official ones, but quiet observations. Why had I hesitated? Why had I delayed? Why was I no longer responding the same way? I gave answers, careful ones, controlled ones, but I knew it would not be enough, because once doubt enters the system, it spreads, and those in control do not allow that. I began to notice things, subtle at first, then clearer. I was being watched, not constantly, but enough to remind me that I was no longer invisible, that my actions were being measured, that my loyalty was being questioned. There were conversations that stopped when I approached. There were looks that lasted a moment too long. There were changes in assignments, small shifts, but meaningful. And with those changes came something else. Fear. Not the kind I had felt before. Not fear of attack. Not fear of the unknown. But fear of what happens when you stand against something larger than yourself. Because I understood something now. This was not just about one order or one decision. This was a system, a structure, built to continue, built to protect itself, and I had stepped outside of it, even if only slightly, even if only once. That was enough. I realized that I had been part of something much bigger than I had allowed myself to see. Not just a series of missions, but a process, a deliberate effort to remove, to silence, to reshape, and I had carried it out without fully understanding it. That realization did not bring clarity. It brought responsibility, because now I could no longer say I did not know. Now I could no longer pretend. I stood in a position where I had to decide again, not just whether to follow orders, but whether to continue being part of the system at all. And that decision was more dangerous than any mission I had faced, because leaving was not simple. There was no clear exit, no safe path, no protection. Only risk, only uncertainty, only consequences. I began to think about what would happen next if I continued to refuse, if I spoke, if I tried to expose what was happening. The possibilities were clear. I could be removed, silenced, disappeared, in the same way others had been. That thought stayed with me, not as a fear that stopped me, but as a reality I had to accept. Because truth does not come without cost, and I had already delayed too long. There are moments in life where you understand that silence is no longer an option. That moment had come. I could not return to who I was before. I could not continue as if nothing had changed, and I could not ignore what I now knew. So I stood there, between two paths, one that led back into the system, back into obedience, back into silence, and another that led into uncertainty, into danger, into truth. I understood something clearly then. No system, no order, no authority can turn wrongdoing into something right. It can only make it easier to continue. And I had already continued long enough. There comes a moment when thinking is no longer enough, when reflection, regret, and hesitation reach their limit, and what remains is a decision. I had reached that moment. I stood between two paths, and both were clear. The first was familiar. Continue. Follow orders. Silence the questions. Push down the regret. Return to the structure that had defined me. It was the safer path, the expected path, the path that required nothing new, except the abandonment of what was left of my conscience. The second path was different. Stop. Refuse. Accept the consequences. Face everything I had done without protection. It was uncertain, dangerous, and irreversibly. I knew what each path demanded. The first demanded silence. The second demanded truth. And truth is never easy. I thought about the lives I had taken, not as numbers, not as missions, but as people. I thought about Father Emmanuel, his calm, his words, "My son, I will pray for you." I thought about the others, the ones whose names I had forgotten, the ones who had disappeared without explanation, the ones who had trusted and never understood why. And then I thought about the child, her voice, her question, "Are you going to kill us?" That question had followed me. It had broken through everything I had built. And now it stood in front of me again, not as a memory, but as a choice. Because in many ways, that question had not been about that moment. It had been about all moments, about who I was, about what I would choose. And I realized something. I had already taken too much, too many lives, too many chances, too much of myself. I could not continue, not because I was afraid, but because there was nothing left to justify, nothing left to believe in, only truth. And truth does not allow continuation without consequence. So I made the decision. I would stop, not gradually, not temporarily, completely. I would not carry out another order like that, no matter the cost, no matter the risk, no matter what it meant for my future. The moment I accepted that, something shifted. Not relief, not peace, but clarity. A clarity that comes when you stop lying to yourself, when you stop pretending that you do not know, when you finally stand in front of your own actions and accept them. I knew what would come next. Suspicion, pressure, possibly worse. I knew that I was stepping into something uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I was choosing, not reacting, not obeying, choosing. And that made all the difference. Because even in the darkest situations, there is always a moment where a person can decide who they are, not who they were told to be, not who they became through habit, but who they truly are. That moment had arrived for me, and I chose to stop. Not because it erased what I had done, nothing could do that, but because continuing would destroy what remained. I had lost too much already. I would not lose everything. There is a cost to every decision, and I accepted that cost fully, because some things are more important than safety, more important than obedience, more important than survival itself. One of those things is the truth. And once you see it clearly, you cannot turn away. I am not telling this story to be forgiven. I know that some things cannot be undone. Some actions leave marks that do not fade. Some choices stay with you for the rest of your life. I accept that. I carry it every day. I tell this story because silence would be worse. Because if I remain quiet, then what happened disappears, and the people I wronged are forgotten. I cannot allow that. There was a time when I believed I was protecting my country, that I was standing on the side of order, that what I did was necessary. But now I understand something I did not understand then. No order, no command, no system can justify the taking of innocent life. It does not matter how it is explained. It does not matter what words are used. It does not matter who gives the command. Wrong remains wrong, and I was part of it. I cannot change that. I cannot erase it. I cannot return to those moments and choose differently. All I can do now is speak the truth, clearly, without excuse, without hiding behind duty. Because duty is not a shield. It does not remove responsibility. It does not transform violence into justice. It only delays the moment when you must face what you have done, and that moment always comes. For me, it came slowly, through doubt, through memory, through regret, until it became impossible to ignore. I stand here now, not as the man I was then, but as someone who has seen what blind obedience can lead to, what happens when a person stops questioning, when they allow authority to replace conscience, when they believe that following orders is enough. It is not enough. And I learned that, too late, there are things that stay with me. Faces, voices, moments that return without warning. I do not try to push them away anymore, because they are part of the truth. And the truth must be faced, not avoided, not softened, faced. I know that some who hear this will judge me. Some will reject what I say. Some will say that nothing can come from these words, that they change nothing. Maybe they are right, but I also believe this, that truth, even when it comes late, still matters, because it prevents silence from becoming the final story, because it reminds others of what can happen, and because it gives a chance, however small, for something different to begin. I do not ask for understanding. I do not ask for sympathy. I do not ask for forgiveness. I speak because I must, because my conscience no longer allows silence, because the weight of what I have done cannot be carried quietly anymore, and because if even one person hears this and chooses differently, then these words will not be empty. I once believed I was a protector, but the truth is, I helped destroy lives, and in doing so, I damaged my own soul. That is the truth. Nothing more, nothing less. There are moments in a man's life when everything becomes still, not because the world has changed, but because he has. I stand before you now, not as the man I once was, but as someone who has walked through darkness and can no longer pretend that it was light. What I have told you is not easy to hear. It is not easy to say, but it is necessary, because the world does not change through silence. It changes when truth is spoken, even when that truth is uncomfortable. I have spent many nights thinking about what could have been different, what I could have done, what I should have questioned, what I should have refused sooner. But the past does not change. It does not return. It does not give us another chance. What it does give us is a lesson. And that lesson must not be wasted. I speak now not only as a man, but as a leader. And to those who lead, whether in nations, in communities, or in families, I want to say this clearly. Power is not protection from responsibility. Authority does not replace conscience. And leadership is not proven through control, but through truth. There is a danger that comes with power, a quiet danger. It does not arrive loudly. It does not announce itself. It grows slowly when decisions are no longer questioned, when orders are no longer examined, when outcomes matter more than the means used to achieve them. That is how it begins. And if no one stops it, it continues. I was once part of that continuation, and I know now how easily it can happen. Not because people are born without conscience, but because they learn to ignore it. They learn to replace it with duty, with loyalty, with fear, and over time, they forget how to listen to it at all. That is why I speak, because I want those who hear this to understand something important. There is always a moment before it is too late, a moment where you can stop, a moment where you can question, a moment where you can choose differently. Do not wait for that moment to pass. Do not silence it, because once it is gone, it is very difficult to find again. I also speak to those who feel lost, those who carry regret, those who believe that what they have done defines them completely. I understand that weight. I carry it myself. But I have also learned this. Acknowledging the truth is the first step toward change, not the final step, but the first. And without that step, nothing else can follow. There is still a path forward, not a path that erases the past, but a path that refuses to repeat it. A path that chooses truth, even when it is difficult. A path that chooses life over destruction. I have come to believe that no life is without value. No voice should be silenced. No belief should be met with violence. Because once we accept that, we begin to lose something far greater than control. we lose our humanity. And when that is lost, everything else follows. I want a different future, not only for myself, but for my country, for Africa, and for the world. A future where leaders do not hide behind power, where soldiers are not asked to abandon their conscience, where faith is not used as a weapon, but as a source of peace. I know that this future will not come easily. It will require courage. It will require honesty. It will require people who are willing to stand, even when it is difficult, but it is possible. And it begins with truth. If you have listened this far, then you have already taken a step toward understanding, a step toward awareness, and perhaps a step toward change. If these words have reached you, if they have made you pause, if they have made you think, then do not let that moment pass unnoticed. Hold on to it, reflect on it, and if you feel it is worth sharing, let it continue beyond you, not as a message of fear, but as a message of truth, because truth only has power when it is carried forward. I do not stand here as a perfect man. I stand here as a man who has made mistakes, grave mistakes, but also as a man who has chosen not to hide from them. And that choice is what defines me now. My hope is simple, that the world moves toward peace, that Africa finds stability and dignity, that those who lead do so with conscience, not just authority, and that those who follow never forget that they still have a choice. Always, even in the darkest moments, there is always a choice. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and what I have shared with you is the truth. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and these words come from the truth I can no longer silence. I am Ibrahim Traoré, President of Burkina Faso, and this story is the truth I must carry and speak.